Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Lepke and I am the head of marketing for Pro Writing Aid and the editor of the Pro Writing Aid blog. And in the past few years, I have edited over 1,000 articles for the Pro Writing Aid blog, as well as all 7 books in our writing resource library. I'm also an indie writer myself, and I'm working on my first novel, so I think we'll probably all have something in common there. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I love the Alliance of Independent Authors. I just think it's such an amazing resource, and so it's great to be part of the conference this weekend. So today we're going to be focusing on copy editing, and before we start, I just wanted to make clear that this is quite a different skill from substantive editing or story editing. Copy editing is all about the technical elements of your writing. It's the structure that helps you get your ideas across. It's about how you can use specific words and sentence constructions in order to make your writing stronger and more compelling. And in terms of writing and editing process, every writer is different. And I'm sure that there are many of you out there who find writing the first draft pure joy and then find the editing phase a real struggle. Others will be more like me. I enjoy the writing side of things, but I really get a perverse pleasure out of the editing part. I love polishing writing and really making it sing. And focusing on specific techniques like the ones I'm going to talk about today helps me see the individual trees and not just the forest. So I just wanted to start with my favorite quote about editing. As I'm writing my first draft, I'm reminding myself that I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so later I can build sandcastles. And Shannon Hale is the master of the concise word. There is not a spare word in any of her books. She's a genius. And I too, I wouldn't say I'm Shannon Hale, but I also love carving the sandcastles. My first draft is usually dramatically different from the manuscript that I end up with, but that's fine. I think that, like most writing, it's easier to see what works and what doesn't work when it's down on paper or on the screen in these modern times. So where to begin? I hear from writers all the time who have finished their first draft and they just don't really know where to begin with the editing process. And this is particularly the case for those writers out there who are more creatively inclined. Obviously, one of the first steps that you need to do is run a spelling and grammar checker. Nothing makes your reader lose faith in you and your story faster than an error or a typo. Polished spelling and grammar is essential. But we have limited time today, so that's as much as I'm going to say about that, because there are lots of great tools out there that can help you find errors, the Pro Writing Aid included. I want to focus today on fixing mistakes, or focus less on fixing mistakes and more on the techniques that can improve the readability of your writing. Because we all know that a piece of writing can be grammatically perfect, but still be really unclear and awkward to read. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. But the first point that I want to make about copy editing is that it's not the job of your editor. So who is the best editor for your book? You! So this isn't to say that you don't need an editor. If you can afford an editor, you should definitely get one, or at least find a really experienced beta reader. Everyone needs actual human feedback on what they've written. But so many writers think that they can just send their first draft off to an editor and then they will fix it all up for them. And that is a big mistake. If you, the writer, don't spend time, and lots of time, tightening up every sentence in your book before you send it to your editor, you will be doing yourself and your book a major disservice. Good editors are not cheap. They tend to charge by the word, and so you want them to spend as much time as possible focusing on the meat of your book. If they have to spend a ton of time fixing errors and chopping overly complex sentences into readable morsels, then they will spend less time on your actual ideas. You want your editor to be assessing your narrative, your plot holes, your characterization, not your syntax, not your spelling mistakes. And of course, they'll also be looking for errors. I mean, typos always get through the net, and they'll find them and they'll fix them, and that's great. But ideally, you will have sent them such a tight manuscript that they'll be able to really work on polishing it rather than fixing the rough draft. It's important to spend as much time with your manuscript as well so that you know it inside and out. You need to know what you meant to say and figure out the best way to say it. You need to have reassessed every word to make sure that it fits the voice you give your characters and your narrator. And if you haven't done all the work, you'll be less able to assess the feedback that your editor gives you. And editors aren't always right. They can misunderstand what you're trying to say. So make sure that you've put the time and effort into that so that when they do give you feedback, you'll be able to figure out if it's the best thing for your book. So let's start with a bit of writing philosophy. Unless you're writing heavily academic material or deep literary fiction, you want to write as simply and straightforwardly as possible. Your writing should always be propelling your reader along, not slowing them down. The last thing you want is for your reader to have to go back and reread a long convoluted sentence because they couldn't follow it, or for them to have to look up a fancy word that you found in your thesaurus because they don't know what it means. Because whenever this happens, you have pulled them out of your world, even if it's just for a moment, and that is the last thing that you want. Elmore Leonard said it well when he said, "If it sounds like writing, I rewrite it." And that's really right. You don't want your writers to be thinking about your writing. Writing is just a tool to help get ideas out of your head and into their heads. You want your readers to be fully immersed in your story. And overly complex writing can also really frustrate your readers who feel stupid when they can't understand what you've written. So stay reader focused when you're editing and get the writing out of the way of your message. So on a practical level, how do you actually edit for clarity? I mean, it's not easy. Editing is never easy. There's never a simple way, just a button to push to fix all of these issues. But as you're going through your draft with every paragraph, you need to think about readability. And it's a tricky line because you want your words to be beautiful. You want your metaphors to be complex. You want your writing to have depth. You just need to watch out for areas where you've gone too far and you've lost your focus on the point of that paragraph. So many writers run their draft through readability software that calculates the Flesch reading ease score. So this is the most well-known readability test that's out there. Even the US military uses it to assess the readability of their technical manuals. It calculates the number of words in each sentence and the average number of syllables in each word, and it produces two scores. The first is a readability assessment of between 1 and 100, and the higher the number, the more readable the document it is. The second is a grade level that shows readability compared to American school years. Now, we suggest targeting between 60 and 70 for fiction. So this would mean that you're writing to readers with at least a 7th grade level of comprehension. And this may not seem high enough, like a high enough level, but you'd be surprised at how common this level is. Authors like Stephen King, John Grisham, Danielle Steele, all of whom have sold millions and millions and millions of books, all come in at around 80. Ernest Hemingway's fiction scores at a grade school level, so don't mistake readability for juvenile writing. It just indicates how much work it is for the average adult to easily understand your prose. And anything above 7th or 8th grade might mean your reader has to work too hard to understand it. You can check your readability stats using a ProWriting Aid editing tool for free, or there's a bunch of websites out there that you can use to run readability analysis. I recommend looking for one that gives you a readability score for your full document, for a full chapter, even your full book, but then that also highlights the difficult paragraphs so that you can go back and decide whether or not they can be rewritten more simply. Another good way to test the readability and clarity of your manuscript is to read it out loud. You'll be amazed how many sentences sound perfect in your mind when you're reading, but that really trip up your tongue when you try and read them out loud. And then another thing you can look for are sticky sentences. So what's a sticky sentence? There was an author named Richard Whittick who wrote a book called Plain English for Lawyers. And in it, he defined two types of words, working words and glue words. So what's a working word? As their name implies, working words convey most of the meaning to your reader. They contain the sentence's most essential information. So take this sentence. Jenna hurled the basketball from half court and watched it soar. Those are the working words in orange. They convey the actual meaning. And if you remove any of them, then the meaning of the sentence changes. The words left in white are glue words. They are there to make the essential pieces of the sentence stick together. They're words that don't carry much meaning in and of themselves, and yet they're still necessary to create a coherent sentence. So here are some of the most common glue words. There's about 200 of them in total, but this gives you a bit of an idea of what to look for. And too many glue words creates a sticky sentence. So it's a matter of percentage. When you read a sentence with too many glue words compared to working words, it usually is a sign that your sentence might be hard to follow. In general, you want to aim for less than 40% glue words in a sentence. And some sentences might go over that, but that should only happen rarely and for really good reason. So let's look at an example. Dave walked over into the backyard of the school in order to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in his class. This is grammatically correct, but it doesn't really fly off the tongue. In this case, 60% of the words are glue words. Let's rewrite it. Dave checked the schoolyard for a new bicycle to use in class. This sentence is more concise and the glue index is only 36%. So you've said the same thing with fewer than half the words and it's much easier to read. So as you're editing, watch for sentences that seem to be full of glue words. Again, it's another red flag that you might need to rewrite for clarity. You can also use editing software like ProWritingAid to highlight all of the sticky sentences in your document so that you can reassess them. But it always comes down to you, the writer, to decide if the sentence needs to be rewritten or if it's okay as it is. So the next thing I want to talk about is the old show don't tell rule. This is probably the piece of writing advice that gets most often tossed around, but it's tricky and sometimes it takes a while to get your head around it. But in many ways it's as simple as it sounds. So, for example, here we've told your reader that your character feels cold. Let's rewrite it. Let's show our character experiencing the cold. What do they do when it's cold? John pulled his jacket tightly around him and turned his face against the biting wind. He shoved his freezing hands deep into his pockets and set off through the blowing snow to search for his daughter. In that version, your reader can experience the cold instead of just being told about it. You give them a sensory experience rather than an intellectual one. Or think about this sentence. Karen knew that Mason was lying. So again, you've told the reader that she knew it. What you want to do is describe her actions. Describe the actions that gave Mason away as a liar. Show Mason stammering and avoiding eye contact. Show Karen watching him carefully. Paint that picture so that you don't need to tell your reader anything. They can interpret it from the actions in your writing. Just give your reader credit. They can put it together. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to show everything. Some writers take this to mean that they have to describe everything in their story in great detail. Don't overdo it with the description. Show don't tell is about showing emotions through action rather than telling people what emotion your characters are feeling. So how do you edit for this? Well, in many ways, it's just something you have to keep in mind, but here are a few giveaways. Avoid sensing words. These are often indicative of breaking the show don't tell rule. So search for knew, heard, felt, saw, or use an editing software to highlight them for you. And again, in this instance, it's not wrong to use sensing words. Just think of them as another red flag that you should double check to see if it can be improved by adding more action to show the emotion. Another giveaway of breaking the show don't tell rule is looking for dialogue tags. In case you aren't familiar with the term, dialogue tags are the words that let the reader know who's talking, like he said and she asked. And they're necessary, of course, but they should just be signposts in your writing, pointing at the person who is speaking. If they go much beyond that, there's a good chance that you will be showing and not telling. So in this example, exclaimed is the dialogue tag. Instead of using said, the reader has tried to add more action and urgency by using exclaimed. They haven't shown the emotion through actions, they have tried to show it by using a souped-up dialogue tag. Some writers will try to add even more power to the sentence by adding an adverb, and we'll discuss concerns about adverbs later on. But generally, this isn't the best way to add power. What you should do is show that anger through her actions so that you don't need a dialogue tag. Amy stopped in her tracks. She turned to Steve, her eyes blazing. "This is your fault." You don't need to say that she exclaimed. You don't need to say that she said anything angrily. You've painted a picture with the action so that your reader can see the anger in her eyes. So try to do this as much as possible. There's an author called Joe Moore who once said this in an article and I really thought it was true. If dialogue is so weak that the writer has to explain what emotions or motivations are being conveyed, then there may be more serious problems lurking. And I think that's really true. So the last giveaway for show, don't tell are adverbs. Okay, so let's discuss adverbs more generally. Adverbs are the words that you use to modify verbs. They aren't inherently good or bad, it's all in how you use them, contrary to what Stephen King might have said. But he's right in that they can be very problematic if you are using them to tell rather than show, or when you use them as a crutch for weak verbs. So let's start with a quick bit of Adverbs 101. Say you wrote, he went to Sharon's house. Went is a nothing verb. It has no power, it paints no picture, and so the author might add an adverb to add more urgency to the sentence. He went quickly to Sharon's house. What you want to do instead, a lot of the time, is use a strong verb that has a clear image for your readers. He sprinted to Sharon's house. He raced, he bolted, he jogged. All of those paint a better picture, a more colorful picture in your reader's mind. Another example is looked. Kate looked at Tom. Looked is pretty weak. You could say that Kate looked furiously at Tom or Kate looked lovingly at Tom. Those are two very different sentences, and it does add nuance. Or you could get rid of the weak verb looked altogether and say that Kate glared at Tom or Kate beamed at Tom. Where adverbs spill over into show, don't tell is when you use them to describe an action that would be better shown. So, Kate looked at Tom flirtatiously and offered him a shot of tequila. Let's see where the night takes us. So instead of relying on that adverb, flirtatiously, to get across the idea that she is flirting, show her flirting. Kate looked Tom up and down. Raising one eyebrow, she offered him a shot of tequila. Let's see where the night takes us. So in that case, no adverbs or dialogue tags are anywhere to be seen. But we've painted a much clearer picture for our reader. They don't have to try to imagine what Kate might do if she's trying to be flirtatious. We've shown the reader and painted the picture for them. And just as a side point, adverbs and flashy dialogue tags are things that really irritate experienced editors and writers. They're a real giveaway of amateur writing, and they just irk most of the editors I know, and me. So you're always better to limit your use of them as much as possible, just so that you don't drive your more experienced readers and writers crazy. That said, you don't need to scrap every adverb. There's no need to be dogmatic about it. Sometimes they work well. If they add new information to your sentence, then keep them. Just again, think of it as a red flag. It's always worth going back and double checking your adverbs to see if there is a better verb that you should be using. So that's the show, don't tell rule. You really want to keep your eye out for sensing words like he knew, he felt, he saw. Keep your eye out for flashy dialogue tags. It's almost always better to get your emotion across through emotion and dialogue, and watch out for adverbs. If you do all of these things, it will really help your story become vivid. Your reader will be able to see what's happening in a scene and experience it as if they were there. So next up, let's cut all unnecessary words. This is William Strunk Jr., the author of Every Editor's Bible, The Elements of Style. And this is one of his best quotes. Yeah, that's a rule that follows its own advice, isn't it? So, what are needless words? There's lots of them out there. As an example, the word that can almost always be cut from a sentence without changing the meaning. I brought over the book that she wanted to read. I brought over the book she wanted to read. Means the same thing, one less word. Another one is very. The bride was very beautiful as she walked down the aisle. It's counterintuitive, but the word very almost always makes the word it's supposed to intensify less powerful. The focus stays on very and away from the verb. So listen to this. The bride was beautiful as she walked down the aisle, as opposed to the bride was very beautiful as she walked down the aisle. Another thing to look out for when it comes to needless words are redundancies. Many authors use words that are completely redundant. Don't use two words that mean the same thing. She peered through the hollow tube. Tubes are hollow. That's part of the definition of a tube. So the word hollow is unnecessary. He stepped out on the frozen ice, as opposed to what? The melted ice? That's water. Get rid of frozen in that instance. She followed her natural instinct. There's no such thing as synthetic instinct. Instinct is a natural thing within that humans have. His writing was full of overused cliches. A cliche, by definition, is overused. Oh yeah, this is a trifecta. So she nodded her head in agreement. If you nod your head, it's clear that you're in agreement, so you can drop that. And if you nod, the only thing you're moving is your head. So you could just say, she nodded, and the sentence will mean the same thing. And this one, they heard the sound of the school bell. You can take the sound of out of sentences like this, and you'll see it all the time. They heard the school bell. If you're hearing something, you know there was a sound, so it's unnecessary to say it. And words like these just add quantity, not quality to your writing, and they will irritate a lot of people. So keep your eyes out for these ones, or use an editing tool to search for common redundant expressions. We've got about 300 that will flag up for you, but we're always adding more. So if you come across any doozies, send them our way, and we'll add them to our list. The next thing to watch out for are hidden verbs. Verbs should be strong and active, and yet many writers accidentally hide their verbs in multi-word phrases. And this process is called nominalization, and it turns verbs into nouns and forces you to use a weak verb instead. So for example, we will make a decision on Tuesday. We will decide on Tuesday. These mean the same thing, but decide is a good, powerful verb. You've hidden that, you've turned it into a decision and gone for the word make, and that's just going to weaken your writing. Similarly, she gave an explanation that the missing journals were in her car. Or she explained that the missing journals were in her car. It means the same thing, but you've hidden your verb. So free your verbs. Don't squash them down into noun status. To find the hidden verbs in your writing, look for endings such as meant, like announcement. So don't make an announcement, just announce it. Shun, like interpretation or explanation. So don't give an explanation, just explain it. Just interpret it. And then the other one that's quite common is ance, A-N-C-E, like disturbance. So don't say that she caused a disturbance, say that she disturbed them. And you'll see hidden verbs everywhere, particularly at work or in politics or whenever people are trying to sound smart and formal. And even in those professional settings, I really recommend getting rid of it. Clarity is always better. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the dreaded passive voice. Again, this is one of those things that comes up a lot around editing, but some new writers have trouble getting their head around it. And I'm sure many of you already know this, but I'm just going to go over it quickly for any who aren't quite clear. The passive voice means that you have written the object of your sentence first and put the subject at the end. So let's look at some examples again. I'm a big believer in examples. The bottle was recycled by Joe, or Joe recycled the bottle. So you need to think about who is doing the action. Joe is the subject, he is the doer. He's doing the recycling. And the bottle is the object of the recycling. Both sentences are essentially saying the same thing, and they're both grammatically correct, but the first one, the focus is on the bottle, and in the second one, the focus is on Joe. So in the first example, you have to wait until the end of the sentence to find out who is doing the action. This means that your sentence has less impact. Action, and the verb showing the action, is what gives your writing power. It's usually better to put your subject up front so that your reader can start to imagine it in their mind's eye. Let's look at a couple more quick examples. I was shushed by the librarian, or the librarian shushed me. In this case, the subject is the librarian because he's doing the shushing and he's shushing me. So I'm the object in this case. Always better to write the librarian shushed me. The local crime scene was monitored by local police officers. Active voice, local police officers monitored the crime scene. So imagine that you're painting a picture of the scene in your reader's head, and they can't really picture this officer and the officers on the scene until you've said who is doing what. And this is backed up by the pros. Never use the passive voice where you can use the active. And that's George Orwell, and he sold a book or two, right? So, of course, you can go through your whole manuscript searching for passive constructions on your own because it always sneaks in there. Even the most experienced writers occasionally lapse into passive voice when they're in the flow of writing. When you're searching, keep an eye out for verbs that have some form of the verb to be, as in was monitored by, is monitored by. You can also use ProWriting Aid to find instances of passive voice. We'll highlight it and then you can reassess it. But like so many of the rules that we've discussed, it's up to you to read it and see if passive voice makes sense depending on the context. And sometimes it will be right. So when you should use passive voice. When the doer of the action is unknown. So the bank was robbed on Tuesday. We don't know who robbed it. We could say somebody robbed the bank on Tuesday, but that misses the point a bit. So if you don't know who is doing it, passive voice works. When the doer of the action is irrelevant, as in the Empire State Building was completed in 1931, the information that you need from that is the completion date. Who actually built it and completed it is irrelevant. In this one, your focus is on the object rather than the subject. So in this sentence, pesticides were discovered in 80% of supermarket fruit by researchers at NYU. Your reader is going to be interested in the fact about the pesticides being found. Who undertook the research is going to be secondary to them. That said, this sentence would also work if you said researchers at NYU discovered pesticides in 80% of supermarket fruit. When you also the other time when you see passive voice is when you want to be deliberately vague about responsibility. So you see this with politicians or in official apologies when people don't want to point fingers at specific people. So they'll just say mistakes were made and they'll hope everyone just leaves it there. So unless it's one of these 4 points, you should think about whether or not you can rewrite your sentence in active voice. It'll give your writing more power. Cliches. Whenever you use a cliche, you are knowingly writing something unoriginal. And I remember being furious when a teacher in the 8th grade did not like it when I described the dog in my short story as growling and baring its pearly whites. I thought pearly whites sounded incredibly literary. But what I've now learned is that cliches will never make as much of an impression as a new, fresh idea. Cliches are what you write when you don't quite have the energy or the inspiration to think of something new to say. And it's easy to describe your character as a diamond in the rough, or describe a child as the apple of his mother's eye. But it's cheap and it's forgettable. But when you're writing your first draft, cliches can be helpful. They can add some imagery without causing you to lose writing momentum, and that's fine. But when you go back to edit, be creative and brainstorm fresh wording for those ideas. It takes time. It's not easy, but it will make much more of an impact. And of course, as you know, if you're already a ProWriting Aid user, you'll know that we love flagging up cliches and pushing writers to think more creatively. And then vary your sentence length. So varied sentence length is an important feature of good writing. And the late Gary Provost illustrated it best with this. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together becomes monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words, write music. And your writing should have a certain music to it. It should ebb and flow with sentences short and long. Too many short ones and your writing feels choppy. Too many long ones and it feels verbose. Keep this in mind as you edit, or you can use the editing software to create a visualization of your sentence length so that you can add variety where necessary. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about were just a couple old copy editing tricks that people have been doing for years. The first is print it out in a different font. Take it somewhere different and read it as if you were reading a novel. Or similarly, you can upload it to your Kindle or e-reader and read it that way. If you use the send to Kindle function, you can email your document directly to your Kindle account and then read it on your Kindle. And it's quite easy to do. And it's quite exciting to see your manuscript on your Kindle. It makes it feel a bit official. Just Google send to Kindle to get instructions to upload it. Because the new font and format just makes your brain work that much harder. And so you are less likely to skim over a typo. And then the second one is listening to it. So you can read it out loud to yourself, or if you have a kind soul somewhere nearby, you could ask them to read it to you. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, sometimes sentences that work well in your brain get all garbled up when you try to say them out loud. So it's a good way to find awkward sentences and improve readability. There's also some great text-to-voice software out there. I use a Chrome extension called Read Aloud. And I think I'm going to wrap up there. I think I'm out of time. So to wrap up, there's a lot more that we could cover when it comes to copy editing, but I hope that this has given you enough to make some big improvements on your draft. I just tried to cover things that you can do on your own, but please do try Pro Writing Aid. It can help make the whole process easier. It'll flag up many of the issues that we talked about today. We also have a blog with over 1,000 articles about all elements of writing. It's a great resource if you're trying to build your skills. And remember that copy editing is about turning your big pile of sand into castles. It's up to you, the writer, to mold every sentence so that it becomes an essential element of your story. Think about your reader as you edit and try to imagine it from their perspective. Use clear language so that they can easily understand what you're trying to say, and paint them a beautiful, nuanced picture full of action and emotion so that they can truly experience your story. And really just try to embrace the editing phase. It's where a lot of the magic happens. And so with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. And otherwise, happy editing to you.